Hello, here is my presentation on the challenges of defining and identifying dyslexia. There are several definitions used to define dyslexia. Two of the ones I'll cover in this presentation are IDA's definition and the First Step Act definition. So in the IDA definition, it states that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. The First Step Act defines dyslexia as meaning an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader, most commonly caused by a difficulty in the phonological processing, so the appreciation of the individual sounds of spoken language, which affects the ability of an individual to speak, read, and spell. So even just between these two definitions, which I know there are various other definitions as well, but between these two definitions, there are several similarities, such as the mention of phonological difficulties. They mention unexpectedness. However, there are also key differences, one of them being the mention of a cognitive discrepancy versus an intelligence discrepancy. So the First Step Act is the one that mentions intelligence, which implies that the identification of dyslexia would involve the IQ test or some assessment of intelligence. And then the cognitive aspect, which is mentioned in IDA's definition, would mean a discrepancy in terms of the student maybe excelling in other content areas like math or science and struggling in ELA. So due to the debate over the definitions, there are several challenges that arise. For instance, some argue that the discrepancy aspect of the definition should be entirely removed because one, there's not proof that IQ and dyslexia are linked, and two, aspects of dyslexia could affect performance in other cognitive areas or other subjects. However, if the discrepancy aspect of the definition is removed, then what distinguishes dyslexia from other reading disorders? So I think this is the question that I really was hung up on before this week's readings, and honestly am still kind of like, this is a big question to ask. So the first quote that stuck out to me was from the Snowling article, and it says, "Loosening the criteria for dyslexia means that a far wider range of individuals now receive the label." And this is just showing that by removing that discrepancy aspect of the definition, it kind of widens the pool of who could qualify as having dyslexia. And later in the article, the authors mention, while defensible on statistical grounds, to regard dyslexia just as poor reading and spelling fails to capture the fact that it has an early onset in preschool and is persistent over time. So I thought this quote kind of answered the question of what distinguishes dyslexia when the discrepancy aspect is removed from the definition. So the two things that they said would distinguish dyslexia are an early onset and persistency over time. In terms of legislation regarding dyslexia identification, the screening process for schools is unclear. State legislation has led to the use of RTI and MTSS as part of the identification process. However, something I thought was interesting is that schools don't always implement effective RTI and MTSS supports. In the Rice and Gilson article, this quote stuck out to me. It says, "Another recent survey of teachers in the United States found similar results, with about 48% of teachers saying they do not use or collect student progress data." So this would obviously lead to an under identification of students with dyslexia. So after reading the course readings and watching videos so far this semester, some things that I think are key to identification would be frequent screening, and that means starting early in preschool. ongoing screening, so a couple times a year, and that would mean most likely moving beyond just, pre-K through third grade. And then I think a huge one is teacher education and awareness of dyslexia. So a quote that stuck out to me in the Elliott chapter that we read this week is, um, at the current time, it is unclear how any particular individual can be meaningfully identified as a member of a dyslexic subgroup within a wider pool of poor decoders. So what I've learned so far this semester is that dyslexia is very complex. The various definitions and the confusion around legislation leads to identification and just defining dyslexia to be quite challenging and very complicated. So some questions and just things that I'm still wondering are, what does Georgia state legislation look like in terms of dyslexia identification in schools? And then what are specific county policies surrounding dyslexia in local counties? I think that something I've noticed is, as a teacher, dyslexia is something that, I've been teaching for 5 years, and it's something that I've heard very sparingly. And so I'm just curious what are county policies for the counties that I've worked for, um, and what do identification processes look like in the schools that I've worked for. And then the final point that I put here is, I'm curious to learn more about the neurobiology in relation to dyslexia. The chapter that we just read of Elliott's, the dyslexia debate, I think mentioned that she was going to take a more neurobiological and cognitive approach. So I'm curious to learn more about that. And here are my references for the PowerPoint. I hope you enjoyed, and please let me know if you have any questions.